Hey friends, my name is Clay Long. Like was said earlier, I get to be the area director for Young Life. And if you don't know, Young Life is a nonprofit Christian outreach organization for teenagers. It was started in 1941, but has been in Decatur since 2016. And here in Decatur, we have three types of ministries. We have Young Life for high school kids. We have Young Life Capernaum, which is for teens with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then we have Young Lives, our ministry for teen moms, which you've probably heard of before because City Church has done so much for our ministry for teen moms. Ashley runs our childcare. We do all of our clubs here. And likely there's a good chance that a lot of you have helped yourselves with childcare at a Young Lives club. So I'm so grateful. And we are so grateful to have City Church in our corner, partnering with us in ministry. We could never say thank you enough. So thank you so much, because we truly could not do what we do for teen moms in our town without your support and your help. So we're really grateful. But I've been in Decatur for a little over a year now in this role. So I feel like a year in to being a Decatur resident, I feel like I finally can kind of tentatively say I'm a local. I don't know. It took a little while. And I feel like I can say that because I've seen some mile markers over this past year. Like one mile marker that made me feel like a local was when I finally could get around without using my phone. I felt like, okay, I really live here now. Because there's two roads, there's 6th Avenue and Beltline, and once I learned that was it. I was like, I'll be honest, it didn't take that long. It took like 2 weeks, I think, tops. And so that was a mile marker, made me feel like a local. Another one was finally getting to go to the Alabama Balloons Jubilee. That felt really cool. That felt special. I felt like a real Decatur resident. And then another mile marker was going to the Alabama Balloons Jubilee and it getting canceled because of weather. That also felt like, all right, I really live in Decatur now. This is special. And so I'm grateful to be a resident. If you knew me, you would have heard me say a million times over this past year, I've been so grateful for how I've been welcomed by this town and community, and it's made home feel like home in a hurry. And I have good news for all of you fellow Decatur residents. We are getting a new resident, a new neighbor, because I'm engaged, folks. That's right. You can make some noise for me. Stop, guys. They said it couldn't be done. They said it would never happen. Look at us now. This is a picture of me and my fiance, Georgia. She's the best. You're going to love her so much. She's going to be your favorite neighbor in a hurry. We get married in December, a little over 2 months, which I'm very, very excited. And getting this close to the wedding, of course, we've been going down memory lane a ton. Reminiscing on our relationship, including the day we got married, or we met. We haven't got married yet. The day we met a few years ago, I was working for Young Life in Columbus, Georgia, and I just left a high school football game, and I called my buddy Ben, and I was like, "Hey, what are you doing? Like, I don't have anything to do." And he said that he, some friends, and his girlfriend had a bunch of her buddies from her hometown. A bunch of them were just watching football. And I had never called Ben before on a whim, but fortunately I did that day because Georgia was one of the friends that was in town that weekend watching football at this house. And for no reason other than the Lord is too kind to me, Georgia and I ended up in the kitchen at the same time together. And we just started talking. And we just kept talking. And I kind of realized, like, oh my gosh, like, I don't want to stop talking to her, but like, she doesn't seem like she's going anywhere either. This is weird. Like, I was kind of floating above my body. I couldn't believe it was happening. It was incredible. It was so great. We were really hitting it off. And at some point, we realized we had a mutual friend. And so it gave me this great excuse to be like, oh, let me send a picture of you to so-and-so. So I actually have a picture from the night that Georgia and I met. Like, I'm going to cherish this forever. I have a picture from the first time I met Georgia, who's about to be my wife. But shortly after I took this picture, I also had a text on my phone from one of my best friends in the world saying, Clay, I need to talk to you right now. And so I was devastated because I had two options. One was to ignore my friend and to keep talking to Georgia, and then the other was to call my buddy. But I knew that if I stepped outside, if she went back in the living room, we were sitting on opposite sides of the living room, like we might not talk the rest of the night. But of course, I had to be a good friend. So I said, Georgia, I'm sorry, I got to go see about a buddy. And I stepped outside and I called my friend and we talked. And when I went back into the living room, she was on the other side of the living room. And I thought that was it. That it was the end of the road. But I threw one last Hail Mary. And from across the room, I just said something. I was like, oh, Georgia. And it was something irrelevant. And by some miracle, she got up and she walked across the room and she sat at the ottoman in front of me with her back turned to the TV that we were watching football on. And we talked the rest of the night. It was incredible. And then a little over a year later, we went to her favorite spot in the world. and I gave her the most important invitation I'll ever give anybody. I asked her to marry me, and this is a picture from that day. That's also my dog, Josephine, also your neighbor. And by some miracle, she said yes. You can take that down. It was, it's pretty, obvious to say that me asking Georgia to marry me is the most important invitation I'll ever give because it's a pretty big deal. There's a lot of stakes involved. I'm saying I want to spend every day with you, and I hope you want to spend every day with me. It's a lot more important than, like, let's say, the invitation to go get dinner with somebody. There's some more stakes involved. But traditionally, there has been a dinner invitation over the years that has had a lot of stakes. It's been very important. And that's the invitation to eat at the king's table. Across thousands of years, across so many different cultures, that's always been a big deal, to eat at the king's table. Because eating at the king's table means the king thinks really highly of you. The king thinks you're worth a lot. The king wants to be seen with you. They want to hang out with you. They want to eat a meal with you. That's always been a really big deal. And we can see that in the Bible. The Psalms talks a lot about the king's table. And there's also, maybe most famously, the story of David and Mephibosheth, which I can't believe, I think I just pronounced that right. That was awesome. It was a 50-50 shot and we got it. David and Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, who was convinced that David was going to kill him. But to his surprise, David invited him to eat at his table for the rest of his life. But one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story that we just heard, the story of Zacchaeus, the story of the king going to eat at somebody else's table. And so, like it said, he was entered Jericho and he was passing through. He was actually on his way to Jerusalem at the time where he was going to die on the cross. And he knew that that was coming. This is one of the last stops that he makes on that journey. But it says he was passing through, but we know that he wasn't just passing through. It kind of makes it sound like it was, just a detour. Before Jesus even breathed the world into existence, he already knew Zacchaeus. And he knew that on that day, they were going to meet, and they were going to have a meal together. He wasn't just passing through. He was there to meet Zacchaeus. And it says that Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector and was rich. And to no one's surprise, tax collectors, I don't think, win a ton of popularity contests, but especially back then. You probably have heard this before, but tax collectors in Zacchaeus' day were notorious for ripping people off. They'd say, hey, you owe Rome $100, when really they only owed 50, and they would keep the rest for themselves. So he was a crook, but he was also seen as a traitor because he was a Jewish man stealing from his fellow Jews for the sake of Rome. His neighbors hated his guts because he was betraying his own people. So he was a traitor too, but it also says he was a chief tax collector. So he was probably really rich and really good at being a crook and a traitor. So by some perspectives, Zacchaeus had a good life. He had a ton of money and a ton of power. In fact, that was probably the good life that Zacchaeus set out to have in the first place. Sure, he probably didn't have any friends. His family probably didn't talk to him ever. But this was the good life, right? This was money and power. That's what he was willing to give everything else up for. And maybe it felt like the good life. Maybe he was pretty content. But I'd imagine that things weren't going the way he was hoping they'd go. And I'd imagine that he had realized by this point that he had been sold a lie. That the good life he gave up everything for was not as good as he had hoped. It was a lot more lonely and broken. And he hears that Jesus is coming into town, and I don't know what he heard about Jesus. Maybe that he was making blind people see, or that he was saying things that no one's heard before. Maybe he just wanted to see what the fuss was about. But I also wonder if maybe some small part of him hoped to himself that maybe, just maybe, the good life he had been looking for can actually be found in this guy named Jesus. But it says he wants to go see Jesus, and Jesus was passing through, and pretty much everywhere Jesus went, a crowd followed, and of course there's a crowd here. And it says that because of his size, he was short in stature, he couldn't see. My high school friends might call him a short king. It happens. And not all of us have height, and that's okay. And so it says he ran on ahead, and he climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him. That makes sense. He probably had a better view. But I would also say this. I would say he probably climbed that tree not just for a good view, but he probably didn't want to be stuck in the crowd. The crowd definitely didn't want him there. If he was in the crowd, he would have seen a lot of glares, probably heard some people muttering under their breath. Maybe he would have even caught a stray elbow because he knows how they feel about him. Everyone in town hates Zacchaeus. They don't want him there, so he probably didn't want to be there either. And I don't know if you have a green thumb. I don't, but my fiance does, so our house will look better in a few months, I promise. And these kinds of trees, they had really big, broad leaves. So when Zacchaeus was up there, it was probably really hard to see him. He probably thought he was hiding in plain sight. It was the perfect place to kind of just be hiding. And he was probably sure that nobody would even notice him as they walked by. And it says, Jesus came to the place, and he looked up, and he said to him, Zacchaeus. And I bet in that moment when he said his name, I bet time stopped for Zacchaeus. You know, in Young Life, we like to say the sweetest sound a person can hear is the sound of their own name. It's a reminder to us to try our best to remember kids' names right away. So the second time we can see them, we can know their name. We can say, hey, what's up, Billy? And because that's the sweetest sound for a person to hear. But if we're honest, we also can probably say, your name is not always the sweetest sound you could hear. For example, when my mom didn't call me Clay, when she said Clayton Luke Long, that was not usually super sweet. It was usually a bad sign. And I wonder if in that moment, when Jesus stops in his tracks and he looks up to the tree where Zacchaeus was sure no one would see him, and he says, Zacchaeus, if in that split second it felt like how I felt when I heard my mom say Clayton Luke Long. I wonder if he thought to himself, somebody's told him. He found out. He's heard about what I've done, the way I've ripped people off, and my reputation. He knows what everyone thinks of me, and he's going to tell me off in front of everybody. I bet his heart sank, and that moment lasted forever. But then, to his surprise, that's not what happens. Jesus looks up and he says, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. I wouldn't recommend inviting yourself to people's houses all the time. That doesn't usually play that well. But this was the nicest thing that anyone had ever done to Zacchaeus. Because he was saying, hey, I want to be seen with you. You have value. I want to hang out with you. I want to grab a meal with you. That was a big deal. This was the king, after all, saying he wanted to eat at Zacchaeus' table. It says that Zacchaeus hurried down and received him joyfully, but I bet he leaped out of that tree. I bet he hopped out. He couldn't wait to bring Jesus to his house. It was the nicest thing anyone had ever done to him. But sure enough, people started muttering, because people usually mutter. He's gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. People think if Jesus really knew Zacchaeus, he would know that he doesn't actually have any value, and you don't want to be seen with him, and you should go stay with somebody else. But Zacchaeus actually stands up, and he says to the Lord, behold, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. His whole life, he had done whatever it took to get more money and more power. And after one dinner with Jesus, he's willing to throw it all away. Because he's finally found the real good life, the life that he had been actually looking for this whole time. And he was never looking back again. And Jesus gets the last word, and he says, today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. If my high school friends were honest, a lot of them can relate to how Zacchaeus feels. A lot of high schoolers in our town, they feel like an outcast. Some of them walk through the halls and they hear murmurs, or they feel glances. They might have a reputation, whether they earned it or not. For some of them, the worst part of their day is walking into the lunchroom and deciding where to sit down. Maybe for other kids, they don't feel like an outcast, but maybe it's even worse to feel completely invisible. Some kids would be surprised and shocked if people even knew their name. And then there are other kids that seem to have the good life by all, kind of measurements. Maybe they're super popular, or they're doing great in sports, or they're in a ton of AP classes and they've got great grades, or they're dating the dream girl or the dream guy. But even those kids can relate to how Zacchaeus feels. Because they likely realize that they had been sold a lie to. Because maybe the good life they were looking for, it works for a little bit, but even still the feeling fades because they could always be a little more popular, or they could always have played a little bit better in that game, or they could always get into a better school, or they could maybe be dating the new best girl or the new best guy, and it goes on and on and on. And it's never enough. Or maybe they think to themselves, yeah, I seem to have a good life, but if people really knew me, they would know that things at home are not great. And this is actually all just a facade. And maybe for other teenagers, they've kind of resorted to this expectation, or they've accepted the fact that the good life isn't really real. Or if it's real, it's not for them. And so instead, they've turned to pain management. If I could just numb the pain, if I could just numb the feeling and just get through the week, often turning to things that leave them even more broken and hurting than before. The reason why it's probably possible for us all to believe that that's the reality for teens is because that's the reality for us too. Of all ages, we realize what it feels like to be an outcast or to feel invisible. Or we can all realize that we've been sold a lie, that the good life isn't actually in our career or in money or in power or in our family seeming perfect on the outside or whatever it might be. That all of these places, even if they work for a little bit, they're never enough. That the good life we've been looking for, we can't actually find it there. And the reason that we're all looking for the good life is because we were made for the good life. We were made for life in perfect relationship with God. But in some way or another, we've all decided to instead do life on our own, to turn our backs on God. And because of that, we've all got this sickness called sin. This sickness that we usually think of for the bad things that we do or are done to us. But those are more like the symptoms of the sickness. The evidence that something inside is not the way it was supposed to be. Something is not right. And no matter what cure we go to or wherever we look for the good life, it's never enough. And we're helpless. So instead, the good life is more like a distant memory. Because deep inside, we know that we once had it or we were made for it. We have a longing for it, but we're helpless because we can't get it back. We're helpless, but we are not hopeless. There's a lot of evidence that teens and adults alike are more lonely than ever. So used to people walking by, or maybe even hoping that people will walk by, like Zacchaeus probably hoped that Jesus would walk by. But here's the truth. The reason we're not hopeless is because Jesus doesn't walk by you. Jesus stops in his tracks, right where you are. And he knows you by name. In fact, he knows you the best. That's a scary thought for someone to know us the best, because that means they know the things that we don't want people to know. And yes, it's true, Jesus knows you the best, but he knows you for who you really are. He knows you the best, and he loves you the most. He can't get enough of you. You're his favorite. He's so unbelievably proud of you. He knows you the best, and he loves you the most, and he invites you to sit at his table. And at his table, you'll find the good life you've been looking for, the life you were made for. In John 10:10, Jesus called it life to the full, the abundant life. A life where you don't have to wonder if you're enough because the God of the universe says that you're his masterpiece. A life where you can look in the mirror and see yourself as you really are, as lovely and beautiful as his son or his daughter. A life where you can do good things that matter, but you don't have to be defined by the things that you do. A life where your relationships can actually build you up, where you can love people well and they can love you well instead of relationships tearing you down. A life full of adventure because you were made for adventure. A life full of belly laughing because you were made to belly laugh. Life to the full. And we believe that kids deserve to know the truth. So that's why we in Young Life will do whatever it takes to tell them about it. That's why we stop at their tree. We learn their name. We build friendships with them, often over meals, because that's where most friendships are built. We earn the right to be heard, the right to tell them the truth about who Jesus is and how Jesus feels about them, and that they're invited to his table. And we can make that invitation to them because somebody made it for us. When I was a freshman in high school, everyone probably saw like a good church kid or kind of a class clown, but I didn't get in too much trouble. It seemed like I had it all together. But that was not the case. That was the picture that I worked really hard to portray. But I was so alone and so broken. And my dad was going through a second divorce, and my family was falling apart, and I was really sad. And Ryan Keller met me where I was at. He didn't walk by me. He knew my name. He earned the right to be heard, and he gave me this invitation. and I will never be the same because of it. Teens are often made to feel like problems, but they have a place at our table. Every type of teen, from the goody two-shoes to the wild cards, to the popular kids to the loners. Every type of kid deserves a place at our table, and we can make that invitation because somebody made that invitation to us. And at our table, we're just trying to point them to the King's table, where they will find the good life they were made for, life to the full. You know, somebody smarter than me once said that Christians are like jolly beggars, telling other beggars where they found bread. That's the best way to describe what we do in Young Life. We're jolly beggars, telling other beggars where we found bread. But here's the good news for all of us, that if you've tasted and seen, if you know life to the full, if you've found bread, you get to be a jolly beggar too. That's what we're invited into. That's what we're called into. We're invited not only to the King's table, but we're invited to bring friends. We're invited to meet people where they're at and to know them for who they really are. Not the way Zacchaeus' neighbors thought they knew him, but to know people as God's masterpiece. We're invited to give them this invitation, to tell them where we found bread. And we can make that invitation because we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be good enough. We just have to be a jolly beggar, telling them where we found bread. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to stop at trees that you usually walk by, to stop by people that you usually miss or outright ignore. And you give them this invitation. You tell them where you found bread. That's all it takes. But to make that invitation, you have to have tasted bread. And maybe for some of us, if we're honest, we think to ourselves, there's no way that God really knows me the best, because if he really knew me the best, he would know that I don't deserve any of this, that I'm far worse than he thinks. Or maybe we think if I could just clean my act up a little bit more, and then I'll be ready for Jesus, and then we could start. But what if Zacchaeus, when Jesus gave him this invitation, what if he was like, give me 5 minutes. I got to just do some Swiffering, do some sweeping, get the place a little bit more tidy, and then you can come. Or what if, even worse, he rejected the invitation altogether? He would have never known life to the full. And that's true for us too, because you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know who God is and how God feels about you. He feels so strongly about you that he came to earth. He went to the cross. He came back. All in an effort to have you at his table. Because he's crazy about you. Because he knows you the best and he loves you the most. And at his table, you can have life to the full. You deserve to know the truth. Let me pray.